Hi, Ryan. Hi, Sean. How are you doing?
Hi.
Oh, great.
Hello. It's a pleasure to have you here. I just gonna introduce you a little bit. Sean, well known as a great chef. You know, uh, Sean has been looking for in the roots of the Southern cuisine in the United States. I have been following your work for such a long time, and I have to say that in Juarez, I used to cook your chicken soup and dumplings for the family meal because you know it's really comfortable. It's magnificent. Ryan King from Fine Dining Lovers will lead this conversation through the pressure in the cuisine, how to be the leader of big teams, and so on. So thank you for being here, and let's go. I hope to see you soon here in the Basque Country, both.
Well, thanks very much.
Yes.
Thanks for inviting us. We're both really honored, I think, to be part of this. I've seen lots of the talks leading up. I think they've all been wonderful. We love your set, by the way. I mean, your set is amazing. Very little shop of horrors. In fact, when I saw it yesterday, I went to get some plants for mine last night because I was like, God, their set is so good. But more importantly for me, I mean, it's an honor to introduce the story of Sean Brock. And I think everyone knows who he is as a chef. And I think his story is one of the most unique approaches to running a restaurant, to managing staff, to just let me get the remote access here, to connecting to community, but also combating some of the negative habits that have formed around how kitchens and the human side of kitchens are managed. As the editor of Fine Dining Lovers, as they mentioned there, I speak to lots of chefs and I always really look forward to chatting to you, Sean. I think you're really reflective. I think you're really honest for a chef. And I also like that you've got this intention to try and create highly efficient, but also highly happy teams. And these two things don't often marry so honestly in the kitchen. But before we start to speak about Sean's new restaurant and how he's currently working with this idea you see on screen here, this toolkit that he's created on how to thrive and not just survive in restaurants. We're also going to speak about this theory he's got about bandwidth and also this community diamond that he's going to explain that now shapes a lot of the decisions they make at the restaurant. Sean, I think it's important that you probably jump back about 4 or 5 years, mate, and set the scene a little bit and let people know where you were in your career, but also why you were spending lots of time looking out the window and planning your exit from a restaurant empire that you had built yourself, mate.
Well, I spent, the last couple decades obsessively working on what cuisine means to me and what a way that I could contribute to the food of my region, the American South. And out of that grew 8 restaurants in 5 different cities. And that led to me becoming very unhealthy, physically and mentally. And it's interesting how you think you know what you want and you set these goals, but then you never really truly know how that is going to affect you until you're standing right in the middle of it. And there was a couple moments where I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I had everything I'd ever asked for. The food was beautiful. The teams were wonderful, but I personally, I just wasn't. I was feeling a lot of shame and guilt because I was having to travel so much and I was having to bounce around to all these different restaurants that I felt like I wasn't truly giving what I needed to be giving because I was having to bounce around and I'd overextended myself too much. And so the only way that I saw out of that situation was to completely walk away and start fresh and start with a blank piece of paper. And that was, that's an incredible privilege, an opportunity that I'm very, very thankful for each day. And it inspires all of my choices now.
And I know that health was also involved in this decision as well, wasn't it? Your health was also being affected by the workload at this time.
Well, I ended up with an autoimmune disease because I wasn't taking care of myself, and it affected my vision, it affected my strength, and I now know that it was the universe's way of saying it's time to make some changes. It's time for you to take a step back and try and see if there's another way to contribute to my craft in a healthier way.
And I know that then led to like lots of self-reflection. No, let's say you did your own R&D at this point. You went inside yourself a little bit at this time, and as with everything you do it with a rigorous focus and in-depth research. What did you learn during this stage of self-reflection? One, about yourself and after walking away from this restaurant empire you'd built, but also about how kitchens and management should be done.
Well, in early 2017, I completely hit a wall, and I got to a place where I was at just complete rock bottom and experiencing total misery as a person. And so I had the opportunity to take some time away and visit a treatment center in Arizona for 45 days. 45 days away from work to work on all the things that I had hoped to get to someday. While there, I realized that I'd been living in survival mode my entire life since I was 11 years old. And while there, I started to learn a lot about the nervous system and the brain. And I've always been very science-minded about cooking. But when I became myself personally, when I became the thing that was being studied, I started to feel relief instantly once I started understanding how the nervous system works and how the brain communicates and works alongside the nervous system. And once I started feeling that relief, I knew that I had an opportunity to take that newfound knowledge and try and make some changes in the restaurants that I was operating, and just really the restaurant industry as a whole.
And how does that look? I mean, you have this period of self-reflection, this real important period, because it was also because for your health, this is how you survive as well, by looking after yourself. How do you then apply that to how restaurants operate? And your thinking starts to shift then, doesn't it? At this point, you're away from the restaurants you ran. You're then starting to plan, okay, if I do open a restaurant, what does that look like? But you've got all of this input. How does this affect the idea of a restaurant for you at that point in your life?
Well, when I was wrapping up the 45 days at the treatment center, all of my counselors told me that I needed to leave the restaurant industry. That if I wanted to be happy and healthy, it wasn't achievable in the industry that I've spent my life dedicated to. And that was a terrifying moment because it's all I know. It's all I've ever known. What would I do then if I weren't a chef? And it really is such a big part of me in the way I grew up, and it brings me so much joy that I had to believe them that I couldn't return to this industry and remain happy and healthy. They were right. It was a very correct statement. And so I knew if I wanted to continue to work in this industry, I had to create a restaurant that focused on being happy and healthy first, and then moving on to operating a restaurant. And it is now a lifelong journey. And every day is part of that journey. And every day I strive to try and do better than I did the day before, and learn from every mistake that I make, or that choice that I make. It's quite exciting, actually, to know that I can wake up every day and start over fresh with the notes that I've taken from the day before, and the lessons that I've learned.
And we see here in the background the idea that you sort of formed during this period, which is this restaurant called Audrey, which opened last year. And tell us what your intention was with this. You said to me a few times, how do you build a restaurant that's good for staff and customers? And this fascinated me. And you know, it's why I pester you on the phone a lot, is because I'm fascinated by this idea. And it's a unique question to ask. How do you do that? What does a restaurant like that look like? What assumptions did you make during all of this learning before you opened the restaurant we see there that you're standing in front of?
Well, I had already started to contemplate what it would mean to start over. And then my appendix ruptured. And I thought that I had food poisoning. So for 24 hours, I was at home with a ruptured appendix in extreme pain. And so I ended up in the hospital, and it was lying there in that hospital bed alone that I started, well, I think it was the universe saying, I tried to tell you once, here's the second little thing I've thrown at you to get you to slow down and start making better choices. So it was there in that room without distraction that I took out a piece of paper and said, what would a restaurant look like that would fulfill me and the journey that I want to be on for the rest of my life? And so I kind of wrote those things down that were very, very important to me. And that was contributing to Southern food, contributing to community, but also focusing on health and happiness. And so at that point, I was able to then design the physical space. And sitting here now in the completed space is truly a dream come true, and doesn't even seem real most of the time, quite honestly. But now it's a 10,000 square foot building, and there are two restaurants, more casual, simple restaurant downstairs, with the focus on minimalism and ingredient obsession. And then upstairs, a tasting menu only restaurant, focusing on the future of Southern food, or what possibilities of Southern food might be moving forward. There's a research and development lab that allows us to continue to explore deliciousness in new ways. There is a learning center, which you can see on the screen there, which is actually where I'm sitting. And this learning center has my library, has all of my books here, which are now accessible to the team and anyone, quite frankly, who wants to come by. But also gives us a place to bring in speakers and do seminars and have brainstorming sessions and explore things outside of the food world, things like the nervous system and the brain, communication and conflict resolution, things that can help us become healthier and happier. We're also working on a mentorship program with the people in the neighborhood to help teach all the things that we know about the restaurant industry and the hospitality world.
How did the chefs respond to these classes, Sean? You know, because they're not used to being taken off the line to say, okay, we're going to go study the nervous system now, or conflict resolution, or mindfulness. How do you find them reacting to this?
It is, and I know how it feels because I experienced it when I went away to treatment, and it's awkward because it's uncomfortable. And these are things that we oftentimes push to the back of the stove and say we'll get to eventually, or maybe not realize the overall importance of. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to take someone's brain out of the restaurant and put it into a space where we want to focus on something else, because we arrive at work with such a sense of urgency and so many things to do. And that's the trap that we find ourselves in. And so I knew that I needed a quiet space for that, which is why we created this room. And also the room next door to this one is a Mindfulness Center. And it is a soundproof room that is designed to regulate the nervous system and brainwave activity. So there's a table in there that you can schedule Reiki, acupuncture, intuitive massage, craniosacral therapy. There's sound therapy, there's light therapy, there's aromatherapy, there's meditation space. There are voltage mats to change your voltage. There are various
You're going to have to tell
devices.
us more about the voltage mats, mate.
Yeah.
Every time you mention that, I just imagine the customer sneaking in there and having the starters on top of a voltage mat.
There are also various devices that can adjust brain waves to make us feel certain ways, using sound and light and electrodes. Cranial electrotherapy stimulation is what that practice is. There are also other devices that vibrate at specific hertz that will immediately and quickly, within a minute, regulate your nervous system. And all that's very, very important to me, because once I started studying the nervous system and the brain, I realized that when we are triggered and in survival mode, we lose access to our prefrontal cortex, where all rationality lives. So we're not as smart as we are when we are grounded and centered and have full access to our prefrontal cortex. Because when we become triggered, we really only have access to about 15% of that. So you're 85% less intelligent than you were. And so once I realized that, like, we got to do everything we can to stay grounded. And so that then inspired the interior design of the restaurant, the lighting of the restaurant, the art, the plates, everything, and then the food, to create a space of that is kind of Zen-like and peaceful, is really what this has turned into.
You mentioned this survival mode. Is that how you were running, do you think, prior to all of this assessment and reflection? Do you think that's how many people are running behind the line in kitchens?
So when we're born with what in psychology is referred to as a window of tolerance. And that's our nervous system. Picture our nervous system as a window. And above that is anxiety, and below that is depression, that window. And so we have it as individuals, very specific tolerance levels. And anytime you're outside of that, whether it's on the top end or the bottom end, you're in the amygdala part of your brain, the limbic system, where only fight, flight, or freeze exists. It's something that it's a lizard brain, essentially. It's something that hasn't evolved at the pace that our prefrontal cortex has evolved. So if you're in the restaurant industry, more than likely, you spend most of the day outside of your window of tolerance and your nervous system stays dysregulated. Well, there becomes a point when your nervous system and your brain realize that you're living outside of this window of tolerance so much that the fight or flight response isn't working, and then you go into freeze. It's the last effort that you go into for survival. And what freeze looks like is a possum playing dead. It's how animals survive in the wild when they're attacked. But for us, what that looks like is becoming a vegetable, just becoming emotionless, and oftentimes reaching towards the closest emotion that we can find, which a lot of times is anger. or shame. And these are all things that are all so new to me over the last 4 years. But as I'm able to teach these things and speak this way, and do my best to show vulnerability, the results that I've seen have been extraordinary. Just in the psyche of the employees that are here and their ability to be vulnerable, and not just be vulnerable, be very, very proud of communicating their vulnerability and what their actual bandwidth is, and what they're capable of achieving while remaining happy and healthy. And that's kind of grown into this ethos that we live and die by in the restaurant now. We base all of our choices on how it affects our happiness and our health.
And this was all happening. What I like about this for you is that it's not just let's all feel happy and have a kumbaya moment. The idea is I get 85% more efficiency, more creativity from a team. I have a team that's highly attuned, highly focused. So the benefit, of course, is in creation, which is the basis of what chefs do. And that's what I like about this. All of this was happening pre-pandemic. And the reason I wanted to split this pre-pandemic, post-pandemic is that I think the pandemic affected everyone's ideas. It either sped them up, it slowed them down, or it made them pivot completely. And I know that at the point of you opening Audrey and having this idea about the wellness and the well-being and the balance of staff between customers and everything you've just discussed, you also then had this big impact of lockdowns, and this created something that you've mentioned many times to me, and it's this community diamond. I'd like you to explain that a little bit, and how that's now sort of evolved and is driving a little bit how Audrey operates.
Well, to paint a picture of our perspective and what our reality is here in Nashville, pandemic started. The lockdowns started happening around mid-March. And I have another restaurant called Joyland that's an ode to American fast food. And that was my first new business outside of this, or inside of this new journey. It was scheduled to open at the very beginning of March. And March 3rd, during our training, a tornado literally wiped our street out. It caused an incredible amount of damage. And we had to spend the next 2 weeks without power. And that's when we really started focusing on cooking and bringing food to people who were cleaning the tornado up. Days later, the lockdown happens. So it's really been a difficult year here in Nashville. On Christmas, we had a bombing in downtown Nashville, across the street from my old apartment where I lived for a few years. We've just been faced with a lot in Nashville. And so everything has changed for us. We're sitting in, for the last year, a great amount of stress and suffering. And so for the last few years, I've been studying this psychologist named Alfred Adler, who was in the Carl Jung and Freud team. And going way back and studying and like digging through and finding his old journals, I started to pick up on this theory that he had, that the only worth we'll ever need as humans comes when we can find something that we feel like we belong to or want to belong to. And then we wake up each day and make an honest effort at contributing to whatever that may be. And he went on to discuss our just biological desires to be a part of a community. which is why we strive so much for connection. We can't survive alone. So it's a biological trait that's quite fascinating to me. And he talks a lot about how there are various units of community, the smallest unit of community being 2 people, the largest unit of community being the entire universe. And so I started thinking about that. What are the different units of community that I want to try and contribute to, or belong to, or be a part of? And once I started making a list, I became quite overwhelmed, because my entire life I've tried just to achieve too much. And if we put too much pressure on ourselves, if we try to achieve too much, we will fail. And that failure will affect our perspective on our own self-worth. And so I started reading about this theory called the circle of competence. And what the circle of competence is, it's a deep understanding and realization of what you are capable of contributing while remaining happy and healthy. And that is an important theory, because you have to remain happy and healthy so that you have your full self available to others. It's the same reason they tell you to put the mask on first on the airplane. You can't help anyone if you're not helping yourself first. And so I started thinking, how can I create a discipline and put a discipline in place to help our choices and to help us realize what our true bandwidth is within our circle of competence, and allow us to live simpler lives that are also fulfilling. And so I started looking at the units of community as you can see on the screen, as the like the Wi-Fi symbol, or kind of like a baseball diamond. And at home plate, the smallest unit of community. And each band, as you go further and further out, you'll notice they get bigger and the bandwidth gets larger. And those start as a blank page. And so we go through these exercises and we put them in order of importance to us. And so our rule is, if we aren't contributing what we are capable of contributing while remaining happy and healthy, we cannot move on to the next band. We can't move on to the next unit. And so if we're not taking care of our team, we can't do anything. We can't just keep going and going and going. And so that allows us to focus on, first and foremost, the health and happiness of us. Because if we're then happy and healthy, we're grounded, we're more available. And you can see, I presented here the community diamond for our restaurant. But I encourage members of the team to do individuals. I have an individual one for myself that's a lot different than this. And it changes, especially now. We originally drew this for the restaurant over a year ago, and it's half the size it was. It used to have 3 or 4 more bands. Now this is where we are. This is our circle of competence, and we have to be good with knowing that this is enough, and this is plenty, and this is all we need. If this is all we can do right now, that's us. This is our little world. And I'll quickly go through ours and explain it. Once we are able to be happy and healthy as a team, then I feel it's our responsibility to look at the very next and closest unit of community, which is our guests and producers, because without either one of those, the restaurant doesn't exist. And so that restaurant isn't happy and healthy. And then once I feel like we have that under control and we have some bandwidth left, then we can move on to our physically closest community, which is our neighbors. And that has changed. The needs of our neighbors has changed drastically in the last year. And that has inspired us to create relief meals. So since September, we've been producing 2,000 meals a week for our neighborhood alongside an amazing partnership with Rethink. And that's done a lot for us. It's given jobs to 4 employees who would have been furloughed because the restaurant couldn't open. We've gotten to know our neighbors on a more intimate level. And so once we understood that, okay, we have the ability to produce 2,000 meals a week, but that's it. We'll oftentimes be asked to do more from other organizations, but we have to say, sorry, our bandwidth can only handle this, and that's where we are. And so for our universe, for us on this community diamond, is our region, the American South. And so you can see as it goes further and further out, it's really kind of further back on the stove even. And so when we're faced with choices each day, we have to look at it through this diamond and determine if we're capable of it. And
I think it's interesting to see that, that you say you started this very large and then you pulled it back in, realizing you'd overextended your bandwidth. It's the prime example of you guys realizing that and pulling it in. And I'd like to sort of stay on the first part of this, Sean, and the team and that happiness of the team, because as you've said, without generating that and without getting that right, none of this makes sense, and you can't move on to that next part. And at the beginning of this presentation, we started with this handbook, and we had, we showed this idea of tools and ideas, how to thrive and not just survive. And this is something you've created for the restaurant and also for your team. And very early on in this book, we see this cartoon where there's this angry bear shouting at Commie Bear. I have to ask, are you Angry Bear?
So they wanted to put the black glasses and a ball cap on the Angry Bear.
Explain this toolbook a little bit and what you're trying to do here. And it's quite a unique approach, isn't it, to training staff? Talk to me about this cartoon that people are seeing on screen.
Well, the treatment center I went to in Arizona is called the Meadows, and they are experts and leaders in understanding codependency. And they quite literally written the book on codependency. And so when you're there, you're not only studying your issues with addiction or any other mental health issues that you go there to work on, you learn why. And a lot of that has to do with codependency and this fear of how your actions may affect someone else. Essentially, is what codependency is. And we miss out on a lot of amazing opportunities. And so a lot of that is fear driven. And so Alfred Adler talks a lot about the importance of courage. And how do you encourage someone to be vulnerable? How do you encourage someone to admit a mistake? How do you encourage someone to embrace the growth that comes along with this kind of suffering? And so the key is understanding triggers and how they work and what a trigger is and how it affects each person, and then creating a form of communication that is designed specifically to avoid at all costs any triggers. And so you have to study triggers and understand what they are. And triggers start at birth when we have our first traumatic experience, and this neural pathway forms. This neural pathway is sitting up there in our brain, and there are two sort of parking lots. There's the unresolved trauma side, and then there's the wisdom side. We want all those neural pathways to live on the wisdom side, but if they're not addressed properly, they live in the unresolved trauma part of our brain, of that storage facility. And each time they get triggered, they grow stronger and stronger through forming more dendrites. Well, the fascinating thing about a trigger is when it's formed based on who you were at that time, the age that you were, where you were with your mental cognitive capacity. So when a neural pathway of an unresolved trauma gets triggered, you respond, react, and behave the age at which it occurred. So that's why sometimes when you're in conflict with someone and you find yourself saying, you're acting like a child right now, you're acting like a teenager, you're acting like a baby, that's because they are. That neural pathway is driving the bus, and that neural pathway only has the cognitive ability of a person at that age, which began to fascinate me and explained a lot of my previous behavior, which helps with self-compassion, which I believe is the true key to unlocking peace within oneself. And so if we know conflict is going to happen all the time, especially in the restaurant industry, how can we navigate around it in a way that avoids triggers so that we can stay in our prefrontal cortex? And so they teach this form of communication that is in a 4-part structure. It's 4 parts. The first one, if you want to go back, is how you start the conversation. And it has to be what they call sensory data or observable behavior. And it can't be these broad stroke statements like you always, or every time you're doing this. It has to be a very specific incident that is detected by your senses. And the second part is realizing you're triggered and then pinpointing the emotion that was generated from that trigger and communicating that. And the third one is communicating to that person why you think you ended up feeling this way when you were triggered. And this one is the most important one. And the rule is you can't use the word you, because that is an immediate trigger. When you say you, that person becomes defensive. They go into the amygdala part of their brain, and they're just formulating their response, their reaction to defend themselves. And you completely lose them. And so if you can figure out a way to communicate your conflict without triggering that person, that gives them more room and more space, and yourself more room and more space to have empathy and understanding. And then the fourth part is what you would have preferred or what you would prefer in the future. And the important thing to realize is if you put this effort forth, you're showing that you're doing the best that you can. And we try to preach this idea that we're all doing the best we can with the tools we have. And if I did make a poor choice while I was triggered, I'm really sorry. And it's okay, because we're human beings. And once everyone starts to get a full understanding of triggers, then you can kind of say, okay, well, maybe that's not that person's personality or that person's heart and soul. They were triggered. They were coming from a place of threat and survival. But then the person who made that mistake apologizes and then focuses on what is referred to in the recovery world as a living amends. And that's really all you can do, is wake up every day and prove by not making the same choices that you're trying the best that you can.
And practically, how does this impact a team? You've seen it, you've put it into play, you've taught it now, and you're trying to work around it. What's the benefits of this, Sean, within a team?
So what I found, and one of the reasons that I think it's so important, is it creates what we refer to as a horizontal relationship. And so we want to focus at all times on creating a horizontal relationship. Picture a seesaw. If it's tipped this way, if you do something to tip it this way, you're in what's called the better than position, and they're in the less than position. So you never want that to occur. And so all of your choices and actions are influenced and inspired by wanting to keep this horizontal relationship. And when you do make mistakes, then that's your guiding light. Okay, how do we get back to this horizontal relationship? And I found that there's an art to that, and we refer to it as the art of a relationship. And these three things we feel must be present at all times: appreciation, respect, and trust. And if any of those are missing, or were missing when you made a bad choice, then that's what you discuss. And then, it's all about effort and awareness. If we know we're going to make mistakes, we know we're going to do things we regret and say things we regret, but if we put forth the effort to make an apology and try to mend it, you realize it's less about the rip and it's more about the repair. And that creates a vulnerable work environment where people then have courage to say, I don't know if that's the best choice because that's beyond our bandwidth. And then you kind of create your own language and your own way of thinking within your little community.
Why is this so important for you? You mentioned bandwidth, you mentioned community. We know that you've been cooking these meals now. You've been focusing in on your own neighborhood by cooking these community meals. I know that you're also working on a project to in the future hire all of your staff locally as well and create a mentorship program. Is this all just linked to that idea you said earlier of, contributing, being part of something bigger, and that really is the driver? That's what we need in life?
Well, it starts with me asking myself internally, what is required for me to be my healthiest and my happiest? And a lot of that is a true understanding and realization of definition of worth, and in a cheesy way, the meaning of life. And once I was able to determine that contributing to community was that for me personally, that leads and inspires every choice I make every single day. And I need that kind of discipline. I know people in the restaurant industry love those kinds of guidelines and disciplines in place that give us structure, because we all stay so busy. So triggered a lot of the times. So for me, it's a roadmap to my journey. And it allows me to know each day when I go to bed that I was following that roadmap the best I could, and I was focused and honest and did the best that I could. I can then reflect, determine what bad choices were made, what I'd learned from them, because every gift that gives us wisdom oftentimes comes neatly wrapped in suffering. And so if I can wake up every day and take what I've learned from the day before and try to be better, then those around me are able to get more of me, more of my true self. And then it just snowballs.
I hope you're ready for all the CVs you're going to receive after this conversation. Because there'll be hundreds of chefs wanting to come out there and work with you out in Nashville, mate. I think we should probably call it a draw there and pick up on some of the questions. I've been sent over some quite interesting questions for the team, and I think they're all quite inspired by your approach here, Sean. And first of all, your approach to your community that's closest to you, which is your own team. But then also, once you've built that to that level of strength you speak of and the bandwidth is there, how that can spread out. And I think there's been some really interesting questions that have come through. First of all, let's throw this one out to you. How has your creative work in the kitchen changed from specific learnings this year?
So this theory that I just went through of bandwidth and circle of competence, it has created another form of discipline within our creative process. And we call it the PIE theory, P-I-E. And P stands for products, I stands for ideas, E stands for execution. And so we spend a majority of our energy gathering the best products that we can find from the best people and places. And then we can move on to the next phase of creativity and ideas and curiosity and wonder and discovery. But then the third one is execution. Is this idea so crazy that we won't be able to execute it during service, and we will be very unhappy and very unhealthy, but also the guests will have a bad experience? And so it's almost like our cuisine has its own community diamond, and our creative process has its own diamond as a reference. Because you could have this crazy idea and it be the most brilliant thing you've ever come up with, but if you can't do it 100 times exactly the same very quickly, then it's working against you and doing the opposite of what it could be doing.
And I think it's always interesting to understand the other side of the team on this and how they've taken to these ideas. And one of the questions that came through is, I think, obviously from a chef, and he said, how much resistance have you faced from your team, also your clients, when you started these changes? And also, if you did face resistance, how do you solve that type of resistance?
A lot of the resistance comes from discomfort, I've discovered. And when I was at that treatment facility, we were only allowed to speak using that model. And anytime anything came up, we had to speak in that. And it was driving me nuts. I'm like, this is awkward. This is uncomfortable. It's not how people talk, especially when they're triggered. But it's the only way that your brain can rewire itself to start thinking along that path. And you have to practice it every single day. It's the only way those dendrites connect those neurons and make a stronger, positive neural pathway. And over the last year or so, it has been very, very difficult to, especially as we started opening restaurants and becoming very, very busy, it's really, really difficult to ask everyone to slow down and communicate this way. But we have to realize that that's okay, and we're putting the effort forth. So if we're putting the effort forth, we're walking in the direction that we need to be walking in and not walking backwards. And to just know that tomorrow we'll try harder.
How do you make a team vulnerable? You said it to me 100 times, and one of the tricks here is to make people confident to share their vulnerabilities. And I think that's probably difficult for everyone in life. How do you do that with hard-earned chefs that have worked behind the line for years, Sean?
You make it a point of pride. You make it something to brag about, something to truly be proud of. That I have the wisdom to know what I'm capable of doing, and I have the courage to communicate it. And that's it. To me, that is way more impressive than killing yourself trying to do something that you just aren't able to do successfully. And so you have to it ends up creating a language within and inside the restaurant where it becomes expected for a bandwidth check. And it's like, okay, well, what's our bandwidth? If it's not there, it's not there. If it is, then we can all band together and take care of it.
And this is a question I'd like to get right, because it's quite a long one and it's sort of double pronged, but I want to make sure we get it correct. And this is coming from one of the audience members. And it's written this: chefs, you have to stop sending me messages if I'm going to read the messages, guys. If you keep sending them to me, it jumps up. Chefs who keep the old system of managing teams defend that it's the only way to make it profitable. In Europe, there's a big dependence on stagiaires and codes that are a lot like the military. But it's not only that, it's small brigades under huge pressure most of the times, often underpaid. is it really possible to make a change like this while remaining profitable? And that's the resistance I often find when I push these type of ideas. Okay, it's a great idea, but I'd never make any money. So maybe speak a little bit about how you find that balance with maintaining happy staff, but also turning this into a profitable approach for a business.
So it requires rethinking the entire structure of hiring and job responsibilities, how service runs, how menus are written, how dishes are created. It has to change because that person that asked that question is correct. But those things have to change. And to me, it's more about the curiosity and the effort of wanting to make change for a positive thing, more guided towards health and happiness than success or ratings or accolades. And so what that looks like in my mind is a smaller team, a smaller menu, simpler food.
Do you think the pandemic's accelerated the way we can accept these type of ideas? I feel like probably one of the silver linings, and there's not many, and I know it's been difficult to find silver linings, especially for the restaurant industry and all of these lockdowns. But I think one of them has been the way that it's now much more happy to accept its own vulnerability, using your own sort of terms back at you there, Sean, that we're in very reflective mode. These type of conversations are now happening much more publicly, much more open. And is this, well, obviously it's a good thing, but why do you think the pandemic has accelerated this? And finally, as a closing remark, what do you hope to achieve out of all this? Is it to inspire others? Is it just to inspire your own community because others is not part of your bandwidth? Just final closing remarks from yourself there, Sean.
I'm so hopeful and quite honestly so surprised at how empathetic the public has been towards the restaurant industry and what we put ourselves through to create a memory for them. I've been very surprised. So I'm very hopeful that a year away from the pleasures of a restaurant will create a new sense of gratitude that didn't exist before. I know for me, I haven't eaten in a restaurant in a year, and I have a different perspective on it, and I have a new level of gratitude that I didn't even know was possible. And so, I'm not going to be. I'm going to be more relaxed, and I hope and I believe that that's gonna become the reality for a lot of restaurants, is a closer and deeper connection with the guests, and a deeper understanding of hardships and the work that it actually takes to produce an extraordinary meal and therefore hopefully an extraordinary memory. And if they don't, then they can go eat somewhere else. And then you kind of reduce your community to those who appreciate, respect, and trust your decisions. What do I hope to achieve? I hope to achieve happiness and health for myself, because this building, this restaurant, I plan on cooking in and working in until I die. And that's a crazy way to think about it, but if I can slowly and patiently create a place where people can grow and learn and discover while remaining happy and healthy, because I'm happy and healthy, and I will achieve all that I've ever wanted to achieve, because we'll be able to then contribute in a much greater way.
That's probably a nice way to end it there. And this final message from you, because every time I speak, you're like simple, 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 simple. So this is why I finished this on this nice message from yourself. And the meaning of life is simple: contribute to something we feel we belong to. And I think that alone is a simple way of looking at things. But if we can do that and follow this philosophy that you've just said, I think we'll all be on a stronger path. So Sean, thanks for the time that you've given today. Thanks for everybody who's jumped online and watched this talk. Thanks to everybody who sent us questions. I'm more than happy to have spent the time here. It's been an honor. Any closing remarks, Sean, before we say goodbye?
Well, I just want to say thank you. And what a privilege it is to have such an amazing platform to share all the things that we're striving to work on. I'm very, very thankful to have this platform. And if you asked questions and we didn't get a chance to get to them, shoot me a DM on Instagram, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Get ready for that, mate. I'm pretty sure it's CVs as well coming through. Can we work there? We've heard about the voltage mats in the wellness center. I'm coming there to test the voltage mat.
Come on.
Thanks very much for your time. Thanks everyone for watching. And that's it from us. Good evening.
Thank you.